And now, the conclusion of House of Wolf. Amalie hopped to her feet and was about to shout for her father, but was startled to see Auntie Grace in the doorway. Auntie Grace's eyes were wide as she stared at her sister lying on the floor. She covered her mouth with her hand, looking horrified. "We need the ambulance," Amalie said, as she tried to push past Auntie Grace, who was leaning on her walking stick. Amalie wondered fleetingly how she had made it up the stairs so quickly, and then turned her attention to more important things. The next few hours seemed to speed by, except for the interminable amount of time the ambulance took to come. By the time Charlene was safely admitted to the hospital, it was almost 4 p.m. The family sat in the large dining room and stared at the food in their plates. The American couple murmured their shock and dismay on hearing Charlene had a massive stroke. Auntie Grace gave a muffled sob, and Amalie was slightly surprised to see Wolfgang put a comforting hand on her shoulder. Auntie Grace winced and sobbed even louder. Amalie's father invited her for a walk after their meal, and she rose to accompany him. As they strolled through the hedge-lined walkways, Amalie found it hard to believe that she had been running from a madman through this pleasant vista. As she related this to her father, she felt his body tense as they walked arm in arm. "If I had known Charlene had invited you, I would have stopped her. This place is poison," he said, and she raised her eyebrows at his adamant tone. "Oh, what about Klaus?" She suddenly remembered the suffering man. She could not bring herself to call Klaus uncle. Her father sighed. "He passed away soon after you left. We'll have him moved later tonight. He'll be buried in the family plot quietly. His suffering is finally over." "Why didn't you get him help?" Amalie asked. "Charlene has a way of getting into your head. She kept on at us when we were kids that we had the seeds of evil in us. She warned us never to have children of our own. She was so angry when I married your mother. She insisted I bring you over when you were small so she could make sure you hadn't inherited the taint." He gave a short, bitter laugh. Amalie seized the opportunity he had created with his revelation. "Who's Wolfgang's mother? I've never heard her mentioned," she ventured. Her father stopped walking abruptly and he looked at her sharply. "Why would you ask? Isn't it obvious? He barely left that room except to prowl around when Gran allowed it. How did he find a woman?" she asked in her frank manner. She saw the muscle in his jaw jump as he ground his teeth. "After all those years of being told you're an animal, a demonic beast, is it any surprise that he behaved like one?" he snapped. Amalie's eyes narrowed and she stepped back from him. He sighed and ran his hand over his face. "It was Auntie Grace's daughter. He assaulted her near the gazebo about 26 years ago. Charlene paid for her to go away and have Wolfgang, and then to move to another island. She's never returned. Charlene raised Wolfgang. God help him." Again, that harsh, bitter tone was in his voice. They turned to look at the house, lovely in the afternoon sun. A few feet away, Amalie noticed there was a small group of pigeons pecking at an object on the ground. When they hopped away, she was disturbed to realize they had been pecking at the body of another pigeon. Her father noticed her attention to the grisly scene and nodded absently. "Rats of the sky, we call them," he said. "I didn't know they were cannibals," Amalie said, curling her lip. "Oh yes, they turn on one another. Survival of the fittest and all that," he noted. Amalie could not look away from the tiny bird corpse. What had he done to the others to deserve this? A thought crept into her mind like an insidious parasite and lodged itself. She turned to look at her father, who was essentially a stranger to her. They were all strangers to her, except for Auntie Grace. Did she really know Auntie Grace? Not once had Auntie Grace told her about the House of Wolf. Never told her the stories of the man-beasts who ravaged and raped slaves. No, Auntie Grace had encouraged her to come down to Antigua and supported Charlene's desire to make Amalie her heir. "Do you think Wolfgang would kill to be the heir of Fuchs?" She voiced the monstrous thought aloud for the first time. Eric's expression went from shock to meditative to grim resignation. "Charlene raised him. Anything is possible," he replied. Charlene has been kind, generous, and so welcoming to me. She's a little kooky and superstitious, but you make her sound like She struggled to find the words. You saw Klaus. She shut him up for 57 years and never once let him see a doctor, or even tried to give him a normal life. Why do you think I left, Amie? From the time I was a toddler, she told me the seed of evil was in me and that I was bad blood. Do you know what that does to your mind as a child? To be told every day you're bad and wicked and evil for nothing other than being born a Fuchs? His voice raised and his florid face flushed purple. On an impulse, Amalie hugged him tightly. He was trembling with emotion, and at first he didn't respond to her. Then he gave her a bear hug in response. I'm sorry I left you and your mom. I honestly believed that I could never be a good father. I believed her. They stayed locked in their embrace for a long moment. When Amalie stepped back, her face was washed with tears. She wiped her cheeks and collected herself. I have a few things to research, but Dad... She hesitated. What is it? He asked. When does Gran come home? She asked instead of answering him. Tomorrow, I think. She's recovering quickly, like the tough old bird she is, he said with a wry look. Keep an eye on her, and Auntie Grace. He raised his eyebrows. Where are you going to be? He frowned. Were you serious about what you asked about Wolfgang? Has he threatened you? His thick gray eyebrows clashed together. Amalie quickly reassured him that Wolfgang had not threatened her. Except for shooting at me, she thought. I'm going to do some research. I'll check in with you when I get back, she said. He looked discomfited, but nodded. Amalie asked one of Charlene's drivers to take her to the National Public Library. She was surprised by its modern facade, expecting another architecture holdover from the Victorian era. Once inside, she settled at a computer and began searching through every reference regarding werewolves she could find. An hour later, she was deep into the lore when a footnote finally caught her eye. Clinical lycanthropy. Rare psychiatric syndromes. Intrigued, she read as much as she could find on the strange delusion that had affected only 56 people since 1850. No, this isn't it. She gnawed at her lower lip. Her forehead creased. The delusions of the affected fit the Fuchs only in part. Nothing she had read explained the physical condition of Klaus, and perhaps the Fuchs men before him. Then she saw a news item about werewolves performing in a circus. Exhausted by the sheer volume of mythology and so-called eyewitness accounts dating as far back to pre-Roman times, she thought twice about wasting time on this obviously fake story. She decided to read it, and, as she suspected, there were no real werewolves in the story. However, as she read, her excitement grew. I've got it, she declared aloud, and earning a few disapproving looks from the other library patrons. Then she thought of Klaus, and her father, and Terence, and a sense of horror overshadowed her initial jubilation. It was unbelievable what superstition and ignorance had done to her family, criminal even. Her shoulders were hunched as she gathered up the photocopies she had made, and she left the library walking slowly. There was a public bus that dropped off passengers a few streets away from the estate, so she decided to take the walk. The afternoon sun was blinding, but there was a lovely breeze that cooled her sweat-dampened cheeks and brow. She walked through the gateway leading up the driveway to the main house, remembering her bone-rattling carriage ride on her first day. That had been 12 days ago. There were only 2 days left in her visit, but she had no intention of staying any longer. She heard birdsong in the grand old trees around her. The air was thick with floral perfume. The grounds were brilliant in every hue of green, and the flowers bejeweled every hedge. She could hear the sounds of lawnmowers in the distance, and she could see a group of children running between the bushes playing hide-and-seek. She looked at them keenly and then called to them. They stared at her blankly until she waved a candy bar in the air. That drew them to her. She made her arrangements with one of them and continued on into the house. Amalie! Thank goodness! Charlene's voice, sounding a little slurred, called to her from the dining room. Amalie walked in, surprised to see how well her grandmother looked. Charlene was dressed in one of her loungewear ensembles of cotton slacks, a sleeveless top, and bolero. Her face showed its age, and her mouth was slightly twisted. Amalie was pleased to note that everyone was there, gathered to welcome the matriarch home. They were seated around the elegantly laid dining table, but Amalie ignored the delicious fare and went to the head where Charlene was seated. She kissed her grandmother's cheek, feeling the slightly fevered skin. Her father was seated to Charlene's right, while Wolfgang sat on her left. Auntie Grace, who was staring down at her plate with a morose expression, was seated next to Eric, and Terence sat to her right. The American couple sat next to Wolfgang. "Sit, Amy. We were just going to have tea," her father invited. Amalie took a deep breath and expelled it quickly. "I won't be staying for tea. Actually, I'm leaving Fuchs tonight," she announced. They all stared at her, even the Americans. "You can't leave," Charlene said. Her words were slurred, but her tone was sharp. Of course, this was the woman who was used to being obeyed. "Oh, yes, I can, and I will," Amalie replied with an equally firm tone. "But Babette," Charlene began, then looked embarrassed. Her eyes pleaded with Amalie. In response, Amalie stepped out of the room and called the child who had been waiting out of view of the others. Charlene gasped. Amalie put her hands protectively around the little girl's shoulders. She watched Auntie Grace closely and was satisfied at her response. "Babette? How—" Charlene's face crumpled, and Amalie spared a moment's pity for her. But only a moment. "Babette is truly resting in peace, Gran. She is not hunting Fuchs, not now or ever. This little girl is Mel's daughter, and you would know that if you had made an effort to know the black side of your family who live right here on your estate." Amalie tried to keep the emotion out of her voice. Charlene was still staring at the child, obviously confused. "Who is Mel?" she asked. Auntie Grace snorted. "You wasting your time, Amy. She only know who light skin," Auntie Grace snapped. Charlene stared at her half-sister with a wounded expression. She looked back at Amalie helplessly. "I don't understand," she cried. "The child is my great-granddaughter," Auntie Grace said loudly. "But why did she appear to me and call herself Babette?" Charlene's cheeks were flushed, and Amalie worried that she would collapse again. "Gran, they've been tricking you," Amalie said. Auntie Grace lowered her gaze to the table. Eric's eyebrows flew up to his hairline as he stared at Amalie, and then at Grace. Charlene's voice broke. But why?" "Because of Fuchs, Gran. You were going to give me all of it, basically a stranger," Amalie explained. She could only see Wolfgang from the back, but she could see the way the muscles in his back were bunched at the shoulders. "But Grace, you said it was a good idea, because we know a male cannot inherit it," Charlene protested. Wolfgang finally exploded. "Enough! Enough with this superstitious rubbish," he yelled. He rose and loomed over Charlene, who shrank in her chair. Eric stood up and pushed Wolfgang back. Wolfgang's chair tottered and fell over. There was a tense standoff, and for a moment Amalie worried that a real fight was about to happen. But then Auntie Grace rose to her feet. She was shaking. "You always been vain and foolish, Charlene, but our father still give everything to you. And when your animal of a son attacked my daughter, you made me send her away and then you keep the baby. You promised me Wolfgang would inherit. You promised me he will be the one to unite the family." Auntie Grace was on her feet. She was leaning on the table and shouting at Charlene. But Auntie Grace was not finished. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "You make me send my girl away and you take her baby. I only let you raise him because you promised to do right by us." Auntie Grace turned at this point and grabbed Terence's shoulder, perhaps for emphasis, but Amalie felt it was for support. However, instead of paying attention to Auntie Grace, Terence side-glanced Amalie. "It was you. You chased me," Amalie accused. Terence mumbled something into his thick beard. She felt so foolish for having thought him a gentle, harmless soul. "Amy, I'm sorry, but we were just trying to scare you a little. I would never let anything bad happen. Auntie Grace had the grace to look ashamed. Eric looked at the members of his family as though they were curiosities in a museum. "What is wrong with you?" he addressed the room in general, his tone thick with disgust. Amalie looked at her Auntie Grace. "You could have just talked to me instead of putting on this charade, and maybe Terence wouldn't have hurt me, but Wolfgang did try to shoot me," she pointed out. Wolfgang turned. His handsome face was flushed and his eyes bulged. "I've worked all my life for this place. I took all her abuse. She called me evil and wicked and that I would never amount to anything." He stabbed a finger in Charlene's direction. Charlene, who still seemed bemused by all the anger leveled at her, protested. "It's the curse! I only wanted to warn them about the curse. My beautiful boys, it was so unfair. They can't help the evil inside them." She raised her hand as though pleading with Wolfgang, but he was fixed on Amalie. Unnerved, she suddenly realized the little girl was still standing next to her. She pushed her towards the doorway and told her to go back to her friends. Then she turned to face Wolfgang. "You wanted to kill me, cousin? I never wanted to take anything from you. You tried to kill me," Amalie said, keeping her voice and gaze level. Wolfgang made a dismissive motion with his hand. "It wasn't loaded, it was just a blank. I was supposed to make this big show of saving you from the beast. You were supposed to get scared and leave." He ran his hand over his face. "Nobody was supposed to get hurt, just frightened," Auntie Grace protested. "I'm guessing Babette was in the room when Gran had her stroke," Amalie suggested. Charlene nodded. "She appeared to me and I tried to explain that we were trying to find her killer, but then I felt so ill and I collapsed." And Auntie Grace felt horrible when her granddaughter ran downstairs to tell her what had happened. She was very shocked and upset, Amalie recalled. Eric stood up and came around the table to hug Amalie. "I am so sorry. Maybe we are cursed after all," he murmured. Amalie felt comforted, but she had more to say, so she stepped out of his embrace and held his hand. "There is no curse. It's a medical condition called Ambras syndrome. It's a genetic condition that is in our DNA. It's why Klaus and some of our family members have excessive hair," she explained, and looked at Charlene. "It's not a curse, Gran. It's just a medical condition. There's no such thing as a werewolf," Amalie explained. "But the Fuchs men, all the way back to Lucien and Wolfgang, have been violent, killers, rapists." Her voice dropped. "They killed Babette," she pointed out. Auntie Grace shook her head. "Babette died in childbirth, Char. I told you before. You never listen." Amalie continued. "Wolfgang wasn't a werewolf, but he had Ambras syndrome. And, well, he was a white man with a plantation of slaves. He and Lucien were evil, but not in a supernatural way. My guess is Wolfgang wasn't mentally sound and he hunted the slaves for his sport. Then again, maybe he was no more insane than anyone who thought it was okay to own another human." Amalie felt her stomach turn. Charlene shook her head. "But Klaus..." Eric turned to face her. "It's like Amalie said. We weren't evil. Klaus wasn't evil, but you planted that seed in our minds, and you made him believe that he was the devil. So he acted like it. You almost got me too, and Wolfgang." He turned to look at his nephew, who seemed diminished and cowed somehow. Wolfgang refused to meet his uncle's eyes. Eric sighed. "Wolfgang is your creature too." It was enough. Amalie reached out and took her father's hand in hers. "It's time to go." She looked at Wolfgang, who dumbly met her gaze at last. She was satisfied with the shame she read in his eyes. "Fuchs is yours. Make sure you provide for the family, all of them, black and white," she said. His back straightened, and he nodded. Amalie and Eric went to Charlene and Auntie Grace and kissed their weathered cheeks. There were no more words. Amalie and her father left the house and began walking down the long driveway. Dusk had already settled, and the sound of crickets had begun. "We left all our bags and gear," her father pointed out. Amalie smiled. "We'll send for them tomorrow. I've booked us 2 rooms in a hotel in town." They had reached the tall wrought iron gates at the end of the driveway. "I'll call a taxi," Eric said, reaching for his phone. "The bus stop is just over the next street. We'll be in time to catch the last one," Amalie assured. They went through the gates, which automatically began to close behind them. Far behind them, from the hills where the estate workers lived, overlooking the estate, came a long, haunting howl. They spun around, staring wide-eyed in the direction of the blood-curdling sound. They stayed rooted to the spot for a long moment, but the howl died away and did not sound again. Eric grabbed Amalie by the arm, and together they walked quickly away from Fuchs' estate. The end.